Okay, so this one comes from Bellagio 510, is that right?
Yes, it does.
By the way, something else that's interesting is that we wanted to go into the theory for this particular hand, so I had Mark Squish My Tomato Goon run it from an optimal with strictly optimal ranges, and then Nate, our previous caller, who is an expert on what we like to call live node locking, which is node locking the hell out of Pio solver, where you make a lot of assumptions about what a live player would do, and I thought that we would get different outputs, and we did. So thank you to Nate, who was our last caller that helped with this. All right, so 510 at Bellagio.
Yep, $1,500 cap,
Mm-hmm.
and all the MGM properties are eight-handed right now.
Okay.
We are in +1, I guess, early position. Pocket aces, ace of clubs, ace of diamonds,
Okay.
and we're roughly 3,800 effective.
Oh, 3,800 effective. Okay. So
I
pretty
open
deep.
the action to 30,
Is that
and
about the
then
standard open size?
yes, I'd say everyone's pretty much at 30. Sometimes 40s mixed in, but it's usually 30. So
Okay.
I open to 30, and the middle position player who is next to act puts in a 3-bet to 100, and it folds back around to me, and I think it's a mandatory 4-bet here.
Uh-huh.
So I 4-bet to 310, and he makes the call.
Yeah, first inflection point here too is that at this stack depth, using this kind of smaller, not that it's crazy small sizing, but small for live, I do think that you are allowed to go larger here from out of position. I remember some of the talking about this in the top section back when I used to host it a little bit. That you can sometimes go like as much as 4x here in a given spot. I mean, I don't think it's any type of glaring mistake, but I know that that was one of the things we talked about here.
Yeah, I think I like 400 a lot more.
Mm-hmm.
It's just one of the standard things when we're a little bit closer to starting sack. That's my 4-bet size, but yeah. So we make it 310,
Yep.
and we see a flop
So
of
MP1 calls, right?
yes, he does.
All right. So the pot is like 625 probably or 630 or something.
Yep, 635.
Okay.
We see a flop of 10 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, and 3 of diamonds.
10 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 3 of diamonds. And you've got aces with the ace of diamonds and a 4-bet pot. Okay.
Yep, so I go ahead and make a pretty standard C-bet of 210, I would say. And middle position thinks for a little bit and then puts in a raise to 630.
So just one first quick thing about your sizing here. As I remember when Squish and I were talking about this, that there's a couple of options of making sort of a range bet of actually slightly smaller than this or going somewhat larger towards 2/3. And what I remember too about specifically tight configurations and 4-bet pots, and I think the simplest way that people can look at this, because I always say like in the podcast, like unless the board is like super crazy, you're almost always supposed to see bet in a 4-bet pot. And I think a more specific way to look at this is that if there are no 2-pair in somebody's range, you are basically supposed to see bet every pot. I mean, with the, and also monotone boards too, when someone can have a flush. But here
Okay,
we would not expect any 2-pair to be present, right?
correct.
Right. So MP1 raises to 630. So this is interesting because obviously you have the ace of diamonds. So we can look at this a couple of different ways where if you're behind, it gives you extra backdoor equity. But if you're trying to ever find some nut flush draw bluffs, he can't have them, right?
Correct. Or the backdoor flush draw bluffs, potentially.
Right, because you have the ace of clubs too.
Correct.
And that's really where this hand, I think, is very, very sort of key. Let's roll through the hand, and then we'll go back and talk about it. So MP1 raises to 630, and my initial gut reaction is this is way too nitty to just fold or something, to consider folding. It just seems like you have a call here, right?
Right. I think, obviously, with the diamond draw potential, this is a call. Biggest concern here is pocket tens. And I spent a little bit of time thinking about this and wasn't sure if tens were necessarily in his 3-betting range or not.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we're pretty deep, but for me, this is kind of a mixed 3-bet hand personally. So, anyways, I do make the call.
Yeah, that is something that we'll go back and talk about where in live play, you just really don't see people 3-bet the flop in your scenario when sometimes a solver will say that they should, even at this stack depth. And that will obviously affect the outputs. when
Correct.
you're looking at optimal type ranges. So you make the call, the pot's 1290. Okay.
Yes. I've got
Eight,
1885
excuse me,
on
18.
the turn.
Yeah. Okay. My bad. Yep.
So the turn is the Jack of Clubs. I go ahead and check it over, and he puts in a bet of 1100 this time.
And MP1 bets 1100. Now, now what I would say here though is I think that we can always sort of I think we can all agree that the jack is not relevant in the sense besides the fact that it brings in the backdoor flush, meaning like he's not going to show up here with jack, I don't think really almost ever in a 4-bet pot. But if he somehow found some weird backdoor flush, combos of hands that he's raising with here, that gives him extra equity. Let me do some math here. So he's betting 11 into like 1890. So if you were to call, the pot would be 4,100, and it looks like you guys have about 1,800 left, something like that.
Just a little less than that, about 1750, if I recall correctly.
So I don't necessarily think that you always have to just jam or fold here. And again, we're going to go back and take a look at what we learned when we ran this hand. But here's what my gut was when you sent me this hand is that I would probably call with stack depth and play a little bit of, like I said, what we call Fifth Street chicken from Crush Live Poker. And I know you weren't familiar with that term, where I said I might call here, leave myself 1,800, and if the river was a brick and I checked and he jammed, I very well might fold. And people would be like, how can you fold when nothing changes? Well, again, as we've talked about many, many times, the bet in itself is change if he goes for it at the end. So that's kind of how if you had just sent me this and said, how would you play this against what you know as a typical live spot? Again, then we'll look back at the theory. That was my gut reaction. What were you thinking here?
So obviously, tens was still my biggest concern. I didn't think jacks was ever going to be raising the flop unless they were going to do something weird to try to buy a free river.
Right. You mean like raise for pot control or something like that? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Try to just get a free turn or a free river after a turn check. I thought maybe he could be overplaying something like queens or kings, and then as bluffs, the king queen suited varieties with clubs and diamonds here, since I block ace king of both of those. So I did do some math in my head, and I kind of calculated before I called what the pot's going to be. And I kind of made the decision at this point, if I'm calling here, I'm probably going to be calling the river, just because it's going to be like a 40% pot bet on the river if he jams.
It is really interesting that you block both the front door and the back door in this particular spot here too. That is really, really interesting. So you call?
I do call.
So 22. So the pot is a hair over, was it like right around 4,100?
4085 right? Is what I've got.
Okay. 4085. Okay.
And then the river doesn't help us, and it doesn't help us get away. It's the biggest brick. It's the deuce of spades.
And this is where I said where I would take sometimes the exploitative line if I continued on across here on the turn. So I assume you check, right?
I do check. He ends up jamming relatively quickly, and I give it about 10 or 15
for like
seconds
1750 or something.
Yeah, roughly. He's got me covered by maybe 20 or $30, but right around there.
So you're going to be getting so it's going to be right around 58 and 1750 for you to call. I mean, you're going to be getting like 3.5 to 1 here, right?
Right.
Which again, from a live kind of exploitable sense, I do wonder if I would take the line here of, would I possibly fold now because it looks so much like I'm going to call? And that whole sort of idea is sort of insane, the way that like a lot of people kind of think about it. But you just had it in your head from the turn that if it was going to be a brick, you were just going to call no matter what?
Pretty much. I just didn't think I could fold for the price I was getting given the pot size. So I do, I take about 10 or 15 seconds, kind of roll my eyes and put the chips in. And he ends up showing us red tens.
So he did have that hand. He had the thick value hand.
Yep.
So villain has 10-10. Now let's go back here and take a look at what Nate learned from live node locking. And so from a theoretical perspective, if the villain is properly constructing his range, with raises from what Pio should say, then he has to find these sort of backdoor flush draw bluffs and some other like really, really non-intuitive bluffs that you just don't really see a live player make. Like I remember there was one combo where Squish told me like 7-6 suited without the backdoor, something like that. This is like one of
Right.
these ones where, if you look at a hand history online, you're like, oh, this guy's using RTA. Like, how did he find this bluff that Pio says is like, common, right? So I think that the main difference here between how a solver would play the MP2's range, even if it was an optimal range, is that the solver is finding these non-intuitive bluffs some of the time that don't really exist in live play. Now, the interesting thing is that when Nate looked at this hand and we sort of live node locked and we took out those sort of non-intuitive bluffs on the flop and sort of air more towards thick value, right, Todd? I mean, I looked at the thread that we had that most of the time this is just a fold on the flop, right?
Yeah, I thought that was crazy, to be completely honest. But I guess we're just blocking way too many of the, super high equity bluffs that he would have, mostly ace king and ace queen of either suit.
Yeah.
I know in my strategy, I don't necessarily know in a 4-bet pot, but queen jack and king queen are definitely going to see a flop, and I could probably find a raise for my bluffs on the flop, and then continue when I pick up equity. But
I guess it's so rare to see that. I mean, it would be mostly these sort of backdoor, some of these backdoor club bluffs, and then hands that actually don't have any draw that are comfortable bet folding. And the reason why Squish had said, he pointed out too, and this is where you can learn this, why, like, for example, like 7-6 suited without the backdoor is raised, is because from Todd's perspective, he's supposed to have some bet 3-bets on the flop with certain combos of aces. So you don't want to take a hand that has the ability to have some equity and then have to raise fold it, which is why like 7-6 of diamonds is called, 7-6 clubs would be called in a given type of scenario. Now, one other thing too that's very, very interesting about the turn is that you have the worst aces here. So from a more optimal standpoint here too, if you called the raise on the flop in this particular spot, your specific combo, I think, is folded out on the turn if you call the flop to this sizing. And then the opposite aces, like if you were to have like ace of hearts, ace of spades, would be check jammed almost always. And of course, that makes sense because you unblock the backdoors. And then I think if you've got like a combination of like one of the suits, like a club or a diamond, sometimes called, sometimes jammed, sometimes folded, if I remember, but your combo is actually the worst one. So you can definitely gather information based upon the suits in your hand.
Right.
Yeah.
And I really was close to folding on the turn, mostly because of the relevant suits. And then on top of that, even in this game at this depth, you don't really see $1,100 bets on the turn with more behind. So just from the absolute value of the bet, not relative to the pot size, that's a huge amount for.
It's not necessarily representative of a 2/3 strength. It's more of an $1,100 strength, right?
Right.
Is what you're saying. Yeah.
Yeah.
So how close were you to folding on the turn, by the way? Did you notice the suits of your aces?
Yeah, I made a mental note of both, and it was just really uncomfortable. I was like, I just don't see that he's bluffing a lot. I'm just hoping that he's overplaying queens or kings here for whatever reason. And it just makes the most sense that he has tens, obviously.
Yeah, again, though, like queens and kings, like even if you were to find that, I guess my response to you would be like, even if you were to find that once in a great while as played on flop and turn, I just think that it checks back river. That's why that there's that little piece, which was my first gut reaction of, oh, maybe I fold river. Because now you take out those hands. Because kings and queens, again, even if it raised flop and bet turn, now it's just checking back the river. So now you have to throw those hands out.
Right.
And, you know, when you've got the suits of the front door, it is, and obviously the back door, it's, you know, if there ever was a combo to fold at some point on the turn, you know, this would be one of them. But
Right.
yeah, it's interesting because I don't even know how often MP1 just straight raises and then calls your four bet from 10-10. I mean, I guess that's the hand that makes the most sense. I wonder if he ever does it with 8-8 here too.
Yeah, that's tough. I wouldn't expect to see eights. This guy's an average to above average reg, I would say. He's winning most nights, at least that's what his stack size says, given the cap.
Yeah.
So I think tens are definitely in there. I was struggling with whether or not they were, obviously.
It just goes to show you, though, too, when you guys went through the process of live node locking, there are certain spots that are just under bluffed in live poker. And I think that the flop play demonstrates that. Like,
Right.
that's an under bluffed flop where it's just going to be a whole ton, you know, of thick value, too. By the way, I will say also, if you look at any type of combo draw, like an actual combo draw, and I'm going really down into the weeds here on the flop, like Queen Jack suited with diamonds. And I guess Jack 9 suited is probably too far out, but let's just say, for example, Jack 9 suited, like I would make the contention here too, is it really played this way when it turns top pair?
Right.
So I think that's
probably a move to equity realization and just
I don't think it's taken as
catch.
I don't think it's 1100 like all in to try to bluff you off of, you know, ace, and I do think from the villain's perspective, once you call the turn, you really should have like you're heavily weighted towards overpairs.
Right.
And then maybe one, I mean, you know, you've got like ace queen of diamonds, ace king of diamonds. I don't even know if are you calling with ace king of clubs on the flop? 10 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 3 of diamonds when he goes 3x?
That's a tough one. I think I would still probably see one more.
So even if you had ace king of diamonds and say like, well, and actually ace queen would be a better continue on 10. So ace queen of clubs would be a better continue on 10 of clubs, 8 of diamonds, 3 of diamonds. And of course, because you pick up more equity, because if you had ace queen of clubs here on a jack of clubs turn on 10, 8, 3 jack, now you're double gutted instead of just having the gut shot. But I mean, that's like a real stretch of like 4 specific combos. It's just, you're way more weighted, I feel like, towards over pairs in this spot, which I think would tend to make the villain want to underbluff at the end. But interesting call, Todd. And by the way, I don't know if you caught it because you were disconnected, but I was saying that you're definitely the best graphics guy for the call-in show that I've ever had, and I've had 4 or 5. So you do some really great work. I'm not just saying that. I've had to go back and check people's work before, and I've never had to do that with you. So,
well, thank you. I appreciate that. I'm glad we're able to do that.
All right. Thanks for the call, Todd. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'll see you in Vegas at the World Series.